Ending series, your bonus video just for you from chess.com. This is FM Daniel Rensch speaking. Okay, so this particular position is from a real game, a great game played between two very strong grandmasters, especially at the time. Alexander Yermolinsky was white, and Yasser Seirawan was black. This was an endgame that shows, in my opinion, many of the difficult ideas that we all face in a real game. Many of the difficult ideas, many of the difficult decisions, and some of the other practical things, well, because right at the beginning of this position, we're talking about a situation where White's 40th move was Rook takes A7. And any of us who have played serious tournament chess know that pretty standard, these 40 moves in 2 hours and sudden death and one-time control lead us to situations where sometimes we have to make a move, in this case our 40th move, in a hurry because we need that extra hour. And so Mr. Seirawan was faced with this position now, and it seems like the move should be obvious and logical and not require any thought, and which is exactly why Mr. Seirawan took the A2 pawn without really giving it too much thought under time pressure. But what we're going to talk about is first of all, we're going to go over this entire endgame here in this video, and we're going to see a lot of really great and wonderful ideas, some really cool tricks, transferring into king and pawn endings, recognizing future weaknesses, anticipating our opponent's attacking ideas, prophylactic thinking, all that stuff. It's going to be great. But the beginning of the video is really the most critical part of the position, because at this moment, Seirawan had to make the right move, or he was going to lose this endgame, and he did go on to lose it, as we're going to see. But what's so difficult is why this move is necessary, and really almost even why it helps us. If you look at this position, let's talk about it for a second. What we see here, especially after White takes the pawn, what we see here is, okay, we're going to have a position where the material is equal. Both sides have 3 pawns on the king side. Both sides have a passed pawn. White's passed pawn is obviously a little bit better, and that's because it's an outside passed pawn. As we've learned throughout, so many endgames, the outside passed pawn tends to be a little bit better than the other one because not as easy for this king to come over and catch. So pretty standard thinking. But the only real difference in the position, other than the passed pawns, is the difference between black's structure on the king side and white's structure on the king side. If you look at this position, which one would you classify as more of a weakness, the f-pawn or the h-pawn? Good question to ask yourself. Well, the f-pawn is probably much more of a problem here for a couple reasons. Number one, any of these rook endings where you're on the defensive side of an outside passed pawn and you've exposed this 7th rank, you're going to run into problems later on that we're going to see in this game, ones that we've emphasized in some of the previous videos. But anytime you open up that rank, you're opening yourself to tactics, you're opening yourself to all types of tricks, and we've learned that generally the most optimal defense is positions where we wish we hadn't done anything yet. We wish we've just kind of kept everybody together. Obviously, that's not an option here because f5 was played throughout the course of this game because of other reasons, and so you can't really take it back. Kind of the beauty of chess. You can't take pawn moves back. So, and although I would say the white pawn is a slight weakness if black ever had the time to come and get it, because that is a little bit unrealistic in and of itself, that the black is going to be able to either have time with the rook to do that, obviously with the pawn, or even with the king because of the power of the pawn or other things the king might leave behind, namely like this pawn or other problems. So I would actually classify white's pawn in some ways as a strength, because it controls this square, because it keeps these pawns a little bit binded down, preventing them from moving. Obviously, the g7 pawn is a backward pawn. So even though both sides have an extended pawn, I think what we've discovered is that the f-pawn is probably more of a long-term weakness, and this is going to be very important as we progress in this position here that we keep that in mind. Okay, so what we're going to do here, I think the best way to go about this is we're going to see what Yasser should have done, and we're going to see why he should have done it. We're going to kind of jump around a little bit between what he did in the game and then what he should have done, just because I think that the back and forth and resetting up the position, kind of why I like to reset it up like that, every once in a while, just to kind of refresh our brains what the original position is we're looking at. What are the important features of this position that are right in front of us? And then we can move forward after that, trying to make the right decision based on where we're headed. Very important to do both, I think, as a chess player, to recognize what all the weaknesses are in front of you and what some of the potential problems might be for both sides. You know, the more you can have discipline in your calculation to take the time to do that, the better you're going to be. Instead of just calculating, I go there, he goes there, I go there, he goes there. Instead of just doing that on your head all the time, you know, take the time to really recognize some of the permanent features of every position you play. So after rook takes a7, the only move, believe it or not, the only accurate move that black had was f4. Now, we're going to come and we're going to see what happened in the game, and we're going to come back to see why extending this pawn further makes a difference here. But the main line now would run something like king to f1, the pawn would be captured. After check is given, we can hide our king away safely. We can push a7, and black's going to push. We can bring our king out. Black's going to push his pawn one step further. We bring our king to d1, and all of a sudden we're happy here because now we're in a position where he obviously can't go after any of these, which we're happy about, and we put our pawn in the 7th rank. He's practically trapped on this side of the board, and it seems that it's only a matter of time for him to move and for us to come up, and we're going to win this pawn. However, because of the timing of this move order and the way this has worked out, black actually has a surprising defense. Sorry, in this position here, black has a surprising defense that's only possible because he pushed this pawn to f4. It would have been very difficult. Obviously, Yasser Seirawan wasn't able to do it. I'm not sure you or I would ever be able to do it. Very difficult to see how far ahead in this position you would have to in order to do this right. But if black had seen it right, this position would have been a draw based on this exclam idea. g6, allowing the pawn to be taken. Because one of the advanced ideas we learned in one of our previous lectures, if you probably remember, is that these knight pawns don't make that big of a difference, at least not right away. Now, if he has a bishop pawn, he can run that pawn down and make your king make a bad decision to either let our rook come out or let the pawn queen. But the knight pawn doesn't really do that, doesn't really make our king make any decisions. And really, furthermore, if you can see, not only is that important to recognize about why the knight pawn is let's say, ineffective here, but furthermore, what it does is it gives us another chance that maybe you now recognize, opens up our own h-pawn. So White's not just going to give up. He's going to try to bring the king out further, and again, he should, because he's taking advantage of the fact that your rook can't really move off this pawn. But we play h5, and now he realizes, oh, what are my options? Either I go here, which allows you to get a queen, okay, or I go back and continue to wait, which allows you to push further. Well, if I continue to repeat this process, eventually with the pawn on the 4th rank, he's going to sacrifice the f-pawn and push his h-pawn, and now tell me who's winning. All of a sudden, the roles have been reversed, and this h-pawn is so far advanced that your f-pawn doesn't really make a difference anymore. So your only other way to create a zugzwang here would be, of course, to try to stop that pawn from doing it, and you probably should by playing f3. However, once that pawn has been committed, once that, let's call it, excuse me, once that zugzwang situation has been taken care of, because white has no other useful moves, every pawn is now stuck. The rook is stuck, every pawn is now stuck, and so the only real piece left to move to try to create something is the king. So because of that, we take advantage of this position by giving check, forcing the king up. By the way, if the king was on c1, he'd also have to go here. And then we go to a3. Now, it's very important that we give this check, because any sort of waiting move by us might create the opposite situation, where in the wrong moment, actually here you would still be able to check and go to a3. But my point I'm trying to emphasize would be that if we ever went on a3, with white to move, he would move to d2, and now we're the ones in zugzwang. Now we're the ones who either have to move our rook off of the pawn protection, allowing him to come forward, or have to move our rook off the a-pawn, which isn't an option because he can queen by giving up the rook, or we have to move our king, which is just as bad, as you can see. So it's very important that you don't end up with the rook on a3 with white to move, which is exactly why black voluntarily gives the check, forcing the king up, and then goes back to the a3 square. Okay, we just did a whole bunch of moves here. Let's back up and take a look at this because it really is pretty complex. And what we've seen here so far is actually the answer. Hopefully you took a second to try to find what Black's idea was as I was talking about the position. But even if you didn't, we've shown you something that really is highly instructive. If Black were to find this move, he would have really had to calculate far advanced in that position. We saw that was roughly 14, 15 moves of calculation. But more than that, not even just the Eiger there, he goes there of 15 moves, but the idea of anticipating the Zugzwang and anticipating the idea of giving up our knight pawn to create this outside idea. Very, very interesting, I think. King comes forward. Again, we reach this position as we did. King comes up, d4, king comes over, d3, king gets to d1. And again, as we did these moves, it probably still wasn't clear why this move was so important. But once we got to this position and saw our exclamovich is a word I invented, exclamovich, great word, you should use it. Once we saw this exclamovich idea and the pawn takes it, the king moves to g7. Once we saw this idea, we saw some of the importance of having this pawn far advanced, the ability to create that threat of a sacrifice, making this guy a powerful pawn. So as we said, the position would have led to a draw based on the fact that at the right moment, White would have been forced to stop this move, f3, which in turn takes away any flexibility he has in his position, giving us the ability to force him into a repetition of moves, aka there is no Zugzwang, no way to make this rook choose between the pawn and the defense of this pawn, because of the fact that Black is the one voluntarily giving the check. Now, before we back up and show kind of what happened in the game, I want to ask everyone to take a second to look at this position, and let's see if you can tell me what the other important idea was of having this pawn on f4. We saw the fact that it forced him going to f3, but tell me something else about this position. If this pawn weren't on f4, what else might White be able to do here? Pretend the pawn was on f5 for, let's say. Go ahead and take a second. Okay, we're going to say you're back. And what you notice is that with this pawn on f4, the e3 square is not an option. If we had this exact position, but moved Black's pawn back a square, and White had the ability to create a Zugzwang at some point, let's say by having his pawn on f4, stopping Black from coming forward. If White was able to create that Zugzwang, well, like I said, forcing this rook to choose between the defense of the pawn and the defense of the queening pawn, if we had the ability to force Black to choose between those two things, we would be able to win this endgame because our king would get out there and start doing his thing. But because of the fact that Black's pawn guards this square, White is in this almost Zugzwang of his own, or we don't call it Zugzwang. It's the opposite of Zugzwang, where any move you have is useless. And not any move you make loses, but any move you have is useless, and so we're in a repetition position here. And one of the key features was not just Black's threat of f3, but also the ability to guard the e3 square. So you see that this is really interesting, not only how important a move like f4 was, especially at the turn of the time control, where Saruman had to play a quick move, and so the obvious move was what he settled on. But really interesting to notice that his anticipation of the future position was not very good, because he didn't see this idea of sacrificing the pawn, and didn't really anticipate White's Zugzwang ability of bringing the king to the e3 square, like we're going to see what happened in the game. Or you can say the opposite, not that he didn't do a very good job, or just that it was extremely difficult to anticipate that, and so facing time pressure, he played the logical move and took the pawn. So now you can make a guess about what the Yerminator played here, Alex Yermolinsky. Sure enough, he played f4. Now, Alex had the advantage. Sometimes it works out that way in chess, where you have the time, where both players had just made time control. So he took a second, as good disciplined players do. He actually took about 15 to 20 minutes, I think, and really anticipated where the position was headed and played the f4 move. Any other move here, allowing Black to get this f4 move himself, like if he had started this idea right away, any other move to allow Black to get that f4 idea himself would have not been sufficient. And so that f4 move was indeed the only winning move at White's disposal to stop Black's defensive idea of getting his pawn to f4. Real quick, because a lot of people ask about it, well, What about g3? G3 stops f4, also allows the king to activate itself this way. Seems like a pretty good idea. Well, the problem with g3 is a 4 series of moves here. And what we eventually get to, the rook comes back to the second rank, which is a key move, sort of, I guess, making the king stuck. Because if the king is stuck, meaning he can't go forward this way without giving up the pawn with check, and if he goes back, now all of a sudden we push this guy and we're a lot closer to getting a queen. In fact, White might even lose that position if he wasn't careful. So rook to a2 was an exclamaviach, as we said. So White gives rook a8 check. Black king goes to h7. We push the pawn. Black again executes this g6 idea to create the h-pawn flexibility, and again exposing the fact that this pawn is not a very useful pawn, something we've mentioned in a few of these videos. And so when White's only move is to come forward, he would have captured this pawn with check, come back, and now what do you see? Even though not only is this pawn going to fall, this pawn will fall, and in fact, I'll just give you this pawn. I'll just take him off the board, because what do you see about this position? Aha, even with 2 knight pawns, it is ineffective. Whenever you have your pawn on the 7th rank, the white king is really not threatening to make any progress because he has no place to hide. So what do we eventually lead to? A position where even the loss of these 2 pawns cannot lose us this endgame because these knight pawns are ineffective at creating a second weakness, if you want to call it principle of 2 weaknesses, a second weakness or a second target for black to deal with because the knight pawns are not very good. So all of a sudden we see that although g3 seemed like a very viable option, and if you considered it, you're not a bad person at all, don't worry, but unfortunately not effective because that further idea, anticipating that future idea of black giving up this pawn because of the knight's pawn's inability to really create problems, that future idea makes g3 not a good enough move. So after we see that g3 is ineffective, we should back up and get to what happened in the game, because White did indeed play f4, which was a brilliant move by Yermo, really anticipating where the position was headed. And all of a sudden, when we went down very similar lines as to what we were looking at, we see that the position is lost. King h7 was not actually played in the game, but I'm going to show you why king h7 doesn't work. Real quick, also emphasize why this move doesn't work, because when you leave your optimal position of being behind the pawn, you allow White this quick opportunity to activate, keeping his rook on an optimal square where he can guard the pawn and create issues over here. Black would be forced to hide his king as to prevent check. Now White will come forward. Eventually, a zugzwang position will be reached because we have this e3 square. And when the pawn is dropped, the game is over because this king will indeed simply come to the queen side, hide himself from checks, and get a queen. And notice that the rook along the 7th rank, especially because you push this pawn, as we foreshadowed in the beginning of this lecture, the rook along the 7th rank is a very powerful piece, preventing black from really doing anything over there. And also this pawn, being that little binder that he is, creating some thorns in black's side, make this a very easy win. So taking the g2 pawn would be ineffective. Also, king h7 would have lost the game because he would have been headed to an endgame that we've kind of talked about a little bit, in fact, in one of the previous videos. But essentially, the point is that waiting will not work after king d1, let's say king g8, and he continues to hide the king here on h7. White will go ahead and push to the 7th rank. Black will try to create this zugzwang, but we have this square. Eventually, the pawn will be lost. He'll try to create some controversy. But again, White will make his progress of coming forward. This check will be given, trying to hold the pawn. But again, he's not going to be able to do that because he can't have his cake and eat it too. Can't hold the pawn and stop a queen at the same time. So he'll give it up, and he's hoping that even now with a second advantage on the other side of the board, maybe it's not enough. Maybe we'll be dumb enough to trade down to like a knight pawn or something. But unfortunately, if we are not dumb enough to do that, he can do nothing but wait and wait for us to make progress. Again, we do not play g5 here because we don't want to be that dumb. So instead, we move the king to e6. He comes to the 4th rank. We push our pawn forward. He gives us check along the e file to create some controversy, goes back. Again, we've obviously reached a pretty good position here, having 3 versus 2 as well as the outside pass pawn. But even here, if you don't know the future idea, how to transpose into the winning endgame, this can be difficult. But we have sort of talked about this idea in other positions, so we're just going to show you how white finishes it off. He makes one more zugzwang move, threatening to push the f-pawn, not because pushing the f-pawn is a great trade for him, but because at some point, one of the ideas is to move this rook out and trade along the 7th rank, as we've talked about. So black actually gave check to try to prevent it, and when he went back finally to guard the pawn, we sacrificed the f-pawn, moved the rook to the e-file, and gave this check, and immediately transposed into a winning pawn endgame. Again, one of sort of the long-term defects of the fact that in the beginning position, black had moved that f-pawn. Remember, we talked about that. The opening of the 7th rank, not a good idea. Do not do that when you're playing against an outside pass pawn. Just to make a note, what if he didn't give this check and sort of help us to open up the clearing of the 7th rank? What if he had waited somewhere along the a-file? Well, the problem with that is that if he takes the rook off the 4th rank here, we have another trick we were threatening, which was g5, that e5 idea. And so the point was that after g5, not only are we threatening checkmate, but after he captures, we get to create the really ironic pawn. I call it the ironic pawn because it can be taken by over 3 pieces, but nobody really wants to take it. Rook can't take it because it leaves the pawn. King can't take it because it allows the check. And if the pawn takes it, our bishop pawn runs down and queens pretty quickly here. So what's interesting to see here is that by winning the f-pawn, which again was something we foreshadowed of how overextended it was, by winning the f-pawn and creating this 3-on-2, we're going to be able to win these endgames by usually one of 2 tricks. One is a sacrifice of the f-pawn to open up the 7th rank rook trade, as we talked about. And the other is to keep in mind the idea that if you have freedom with the f-pawn, you can make a sacrifice of the other 2 pawns to create an open line for that pawn to queen. So let's go ahead and back it up again, and let's refresh our thoughts and look at this position. We already know that black missed his drawing idea by not anticipating how deep this position was and playing this f4 move. But let's look at again what happens on rook takes a2. White finds the double exclam of Iach, we'll call it, double exclam f4 move. And as we continued to make our progress, we talked about the fact that this pawn can't be taken because when you release the pressure, you allow him to improve himself along the 7th rank. And we just looked at what happens if the king tries to just wait in the corner. We just looked at the fact that this king will make its progress, win the pawn, eventually come up and win this pawn because the rook will not be able to guard this guy and this guy at the same time. And once we have that 3-on-2, we have our goal position ideas, either a sacrifice of the f-pawn to open the 7th rank and win the king and pawn ending, or a sacrifice of the g-pawn at some point, followed by a sacrifice of the h-pawn and then queen the f-pawn itself. Both those winning ideas will come into play. So the last thing to look at was what Saruwan actually did in the game, which was after f4 was played, he played d4, king f1, d3, and king e1, but he didn't take the pawn or g2 or sit in the corner. Saruwan tried to play a little bit more aggressively with the king, with king to f8. I think his theory was he recognized where the position was headed, saw that he would lose not only the d pawn, but also the f pawn, and waiting in the corner was going to be a loss anyway. So he tried to be active with his king, but unfortunately, we know these endgames, and we know that this king is not going to be able to get too active without allowing us some other tricks, especially once we get that pawn to the 7th rank where we're threatening to queen. So after king f8, the most accurate win is rook a8 check, king to e7, a7, the king has to go back to f7 because of the idea of the rook coming behind, as we called it, the backdoor rook trick in one of our previous video lectures, threatening to queen and taking advantage of the fact that with the king along the 7th rank, we're going to be taking this pawn with check and winning the rook. Again, ironically, one of the problems of pushing this pawn, you don't want to ruin your king side. So, after king e7, a7, king went back to f7, white played king to d1. Black played rook a1 check. King to d2 was played. Rook to a3 was played. And, of course, our zugzwang idea, king e3 came into play. After rook a1 was played, the king took d3. We're headed down a very similar position that we just talked about, except for the fact that black's king is now on f7 rather than in the corner in h7. So after king to d4, rook back to a1, king to d5, rook to a2, king to c6, exclam. Where am I headed? Why is that an exclamavage? I mean, aren't I just headed to a position where he can check me? This is true, but by allowing him to check on c2 and going to d6, when the rook comes back to a2 in order to guard the a7 pawn, what can we now do? Again, keep in mind one of the common themes of these positions is that I don't want to call it a transposition, that's not right, but really a good anticipation of the next endgame step, which is the king and pawn endgame, like a transfiguration, I guess, where you trade off the pieces and change the figure of the position to lead to a winning king and pawn ending. And that is with rook to c8, rook takes a7, rook to c7 check, takes, king moves up to e6, king moves here, and king goes back to f7. The white king starts to make its progress, and eventually the king will have to go back, allow us to come here, and after g6 is played, captures, king up, h5, and g3, creating our zugzwang. Amazing that, would you really be expected to calculate the entire king and pawn ending if you were playing this this endgame? Not necessarily. First of all, you just need to be aware of how oftentimes when your opponent has pawn weaknesses, you could transpose into a king and pawn ending as long as you have some basic form of opposition and find a way to win these endgames. So it's really an anticipation of the weaknesses in your opponent's position and not being stuck on just winning the rook and pawn ending and finding a way to be open to the king and pawn ending as well. So yes, of course, some calculation is involved. You should calculate the opposition really as deeply as you can and make sure you're not missing any tricks or anything like that. But the basic concept is there. We're going to back up a few moves because there's some other interesting things to go over. For example, back just a few moves. After king to c6 and the king moves and we go king f6 and king to d6, when our king is on d5, after king f6, I misplayed the move order slightly. King f7, king to d6, king to f6. When our king is on d6, rather, if we don't go to d5, which was the right decision, to force him to either push the pawn and then we would take and come to e6, or back up the king and allow us to do essentially the same thing. If we had made a blunder of, instead of going king d5, of playing g3, very important to notice that that's a double question mark move after g6, because of one of the really kind of tricky but famous endgame ideas is that after you take and go here, king h5, and as you'll notice, you've blown it because after you take this pawn, it's a draw. And at this point, you hardly even have the option. Can't even try to go here because his king is going to come to g4, and you may lose if you're not careful. So playing g3 too early and creating the protection of those squares actually creates that awkward trapping of the king again. And if you watch one of our previous videos, we saw other stalemate ideas, actually where the rooks were still on the board, but nonetheless a similar stalemate idea where the king traps himself on that side of the board. So g3, don't just push pawns to create zugzwang. If there's another way to do it, leave that pawn back there to give some flexibility, because as we saw in the game, once g6 was played, captures, this move was now winning because of the fact that if he goes here, he's not stalemated anymore. We're going to be able to move our king out and run the pawn. Very important that that's true. So lastly, I'm going to back up to the beginning position one more time, make a review of the fact that f4 was the only way to draw because of two things. One was that recognition that the knight pawns don't do anything. So after these checks were given, if you remember, one of the long-term ideas was that this pawn was sacrificed, the knight pawn didn't do anything, and by creating this open h-pawn and the threat of f3, black was able to induce white to play f3 himself. And once all the pawns were stuck, what was the second important feature of the pawn being on f4? That it guarded the e3 square, preventing white from creating a zugzwang idea. So f4 was the critical idea. When rook takes a2 was played, Yermolinsky anticipated very well the future of where this position was headed, played f4, double exclam himself. After the logical series of moves was continued, we saw that waiting in the corner would not help. Eventually, white will win the pawns and make progress either by a sacrifice and a trade of rooks on the 7th rank, or by a sacrifice of the pawns to make the f-pawn a queen. You remember, you can review the ideas. So lastly, the king came to the center, king to f8, and one other point to note, what we just looked at was the rook a8 check idea, followed by a7, king went to f7. We made progress with this king, winning the pawn by using the zugzwang idea. We came up, traded rooks along one of these squares, and headed to a winning king and pawn ending based on black's weaknesses, especially the extended f-pawn. But one thing that's interesting to note, and this will be the last thing we do, is that king to d1 was not the most accurate way to win, but it did win along with rook a8 check. And it's kind of instructive to notice this because it leads to a very interesting king and pawn ending. After the king makes a run toward our queenside pawn, after this king makes a run toward our queenside pawn, he gets there just in time. We queen, forcing a trade into a king and pawn ending that is surprisingly lost for black. And here we are able to use the g3 move. When the king comes around, we come up. When he goes here, we go here. When he plays g6, rather than capturing and going toward that stalemate trick, we play king to d7, exclam. He tries to wait with king f7, but now we go king to d8. Obviously, he can't do the same because we take. So he goes king f6, and we come behind the pawn. More accurate is actually king e6, so that after we take opposition, he can wait just a little bit longer with king to f6. And now when we take the pawn, and he takes and we go king f8, we have rear opposition, and we're actually able to do what's called an outflanking, where we run to this side of the board, taking advantage of the fact that he can't take opposition here. And so when he has to push, now our king comes all the way back around. If he wanted to continue to wait, our king would come all the way back around, and there's no more a stalemate idea because he's taken away his own square. So after king to g8, black's best try was to sacrifice the pawn. But then by accurate calculation, our king comes to f6, g4, and we get the king dance, as I like to call it, where the kings are dancing around the squares, because whoever gets to this position with their move loses. In this position, the timing works out where it was forced to be black to move. We forced him to go here, and we took the e5 square, and therefore black was lost. So, okay, pretty extravagant and pretty in-depth, pretty strenuous, to be honest, and very, very difficult to try to apply all these ideas at one time. But what this endgame shows you is how a lot of those technical things we've learned, like we said, in the database of our head, the little technical things we now know how to do, and how quickly we're able to recognize weaknesses like an extended pawn, those things should help us in our real games. Sarawan was in a tough position because he was under time pressure to make this move, and he missed his opportunity. Excuse me. Would we have made the same mistake? Maybe. But hopefully anticipating the future of our positions and where our goal positions are, where the position is headed, if we can do those things and anticipate our own weaknesses, maybe we can find a brilliant defense like f4. And also, if you were on the winning side of this and you had the discipline to take the time to find f4 and stop black from making up for his mistake, you'd also be considered a very good player too, because again, you'd be anticipating very well where the position is headed and how to take advantage of these types of weaknesses like an extended pawn here. So this would be called the masterful rook ending, and very, very difficult position to fully understand, but one of my favorite rook endings of all time. Hope you enjoyed it. Chess.com is bringing you lots of other great videos, and we hope to see you here in the future. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.